At 1400 hours on a late summer day in mid-August, everything at a crossroads simply stopped existing. Men lifting spoons to mouths froze with cold porridge halfway to their lips. Tanks idling in shallow ruts shuddered as if gripped by a giant hand. The sky did not roar first. The impact came before the thunder. For an instant so brief it could be counted in heartbeats, the world at that junction was replaced by a violence so total that survivors would later describe it as a single, impossible second. He was a man with a name on a paper. Paul Hauser sat in a concrete bunker beneath a small rise that watched the road like a sentinel. The telegram in his hands ordered him to hold, to keep the corridor open, to buy time. Outside, columns were supposed to move through, a narrow artery for a wounded army. Inside the bunker, the paper felt thin and absurd against the weight of what it demanded. He crumpled the order. He chose to pull back. That decision did not happen in a vacuum. It came after days of attrition, after Allied pincers had cut the map into smaller and smaller pieces, after supplies were thin and morale thinner still. Hauser and his staff believed a tactical withdrawal might save men and equipment from the grinding machine tightening around them. But a column is a promise of movement and safety only so long as the road remains a road. When the sky and the math decide otherwise, a road becomes a trap. 10 miles away, under a canvas that smelled faintly of dust and boiled coffee, Lieutenant Parker sat over maps like a man at an abacus. His desk was unromantic, plotting sheets, protractors, a pocket watch, and a telephone for each battery. Men moved around him without hurry, not because they were calm, but because their work required concentration. They were making time behave the way an armory makes metal obey a blueprint. Their task was to make every shell from disparate guns, 155mm howitzers, 105's 8-inch batteries, arrive at a single place at a single instant. They called it time on target. Time on target is a practical application of a simple equation. Shells take different amounts of time to fly. If you want them to land together, you must fire them at staggered moments. If one gun's projectile takes 48 seconds to arc to the crossroads and another's takes 18 seconds, you must subtract and synchronize. You treat each battery like a worker on an assembly line. Each shell is a piece waiting to meet the others at a final station. The watch is the metronome, the radio the conveyor belt, and 100 arithmetic operations are the foreman shouting orders. The numbers are not poetry, they are instruments of destruction. On the tables in Parker's tent, a single planned strike, read like a recipe, a 155mm round, 48 seconds of flight, a 105mm, 18 seconds, an 8-inch, 35 seconds. A battery using different propellant charges could shave or add seconds. Weather and wind altered the arc. The calculations were conservative, accounting for variation and margin of error. Watches were checked against the BBC time signal. Each lieutenant set his dial the same way a conductor raises a baton. At the appointed second, all the guns would fire in a sequence calculated to let projectiles that left different muzzles at different times arrive within a heartbeat of one another. There was another engineering addition that made those heartbeats lethal: the variable time fuse, the VT fuse. Formal name aside, the innovation was straightforward. Instead of striking the ground and exploding, a shell with a VT fuse detonated above the target when a small radio transmitter within sensed proximity to objects below. The explosion occurred in the air, showering shrapnel downward like a deadly umbrella. Trenches and foxholes designed to stop ricochets were no longer safe. Overhead detonation created pressure waves and fragmentation that the traditional digging could not counter. Where once a soldier curled in a ditch and hoped for the best, now he was open to the sky's own new kind of rain. Hauser's retreating columns did not know these technicalities. They knew the road, one lane carved through hedgerows, a mosaic of churned mud and the iron sheen of tracks. There were tigers with numbers scrawled across their turrets, puffs of smoke from half-warmed engines, horse teams harnessed to rickety wagons, carrying the small, essential things that would not show up on any strategic map. Boots, tins of coffee, the last of a commander's maps. Men rubbed rain from their good eyes. A private gnawed on cold bread, as if the chewing would slow the universe down. Children of the war, drivers turned mechanics, clerks turned stretcher-bearers, sat hunched between metal and canvas, trying to imagine the next mile. Major Hans von Luck moved among the vehicles, issuing curt gestures, his face like a map of fatigue. The 21st Panzer Division had seen better roads and livelier offensives. Now, armor and infantry mixed in a slow, dangerous intimacy. Tanks blocked the lane, helpfully preventing faster vehicles from bypassing bogged formations and tragically preventing any effective countermaneuvering. Air harassment had thinned some of the columns days before. Now, under the constant threat of interception, movement had slowed to a crawl. Logistics had always been the quiet god of modern war. Trucks, railheads, depots, where they existed could determine whether a division lived or died. The Americans had turned that quiet god into a machine, convoy systems like the Red Ball Express, stockpiles sliding down highways under armed escort, factories pumping shells and fuses without cessation. Men like Major Williams managed not a battlefield, but a river of metal and men, figures on a ledger that somehow translated into lives on the ground. Williams tracked carriage throughput, ammunition allocation, the number of replacement barrels per battery. Where Hauser had a telegram, Williams had spreadsheets and an industrial logic that treated batteries as resources to be deployed with mathematical precision. Back under the tent, Parker's team worked through a concrete example. If the target needed a simultaneous impact at 1400 hours, the team calculated backwards. A 150mm battery with a 48-second flight time needed to fire at 13:59:12. A 105mm battery with an 18-second flight time would fire at 13:59:42. An 8-inch battery with a 35-second flight time would fire at 13:59:25. The firing orders included minor adjustments for winds and charge temperature. They transmitted them to the batteries with a calmness shaped by training. Call sign, grid reference, time on target 14, an. Execute. Men checked watches, repeated times aloud, and sealed the sequence in a small, mechanical ceremony of repetition. That calm mattered. The psychological difference between a man clutching a rifle and the man who knows the arithmetic of death is one of tempo. Soldiers in the column experienced time as a human thing, minutes of wait, hours of anxiety, the slow tick of hunger. Parker's team operated in a machine tempo, seconds, fractions of a second, synchronization like clockwork. The two tempos could coexist in space for only so long before one of them obliterated the other. When the order came, it was not dramatic. There was no shout of fire, as in the movies. There was a sequence. Batteries at 3 separate coordinates read the time, adjusted their sights, and triggered firing mechanisms. The first booms were distant, then the sky filled with points of metal, each a small comet whose destination the gunners had already decided. To the men on the road, the first sensation was not sound. It was a pressure change, a sudden weight in the air. The shells were supersonic and often arrived before their sound. That is the cruelest of ironies. The impact announces itself before nature can announce it. The moment of impact is difficult to render in prose without resorting to cliché. For those who survived and could speak of it later, the images are spare and relentless. A tank's turret roof peeling like an open tin, a metal flank welded shut by heat. Men who had been sitting upright a heartbeat ago found themselves flat and broken, never having had time to register the meaning of their injuries. Horses, which had been breathing and stamping a second before, lay twisted. The VT fuses detonated above the road like flower petals closing into a bomb. Shrapnel rained in arcs, calculated by aerodynamics and probability. It struck with such density that small crews became a single, indistinct pile. The impact was a percussion, a fusillade where everything in the crosshair was simultaneously disassembled. These were not neat, isolated explosions. Overpressure, the unseen shove of air, flattened structures and bodies alike. Breath left lungs, eardrums burst, and the tactile map of limbs and mud became a tableau of interrupted humanity. People who had been shouting seconds earlier could not make a sound. Those able to move crawled, not because they chose to, but because their bodies had been reduced to the only motion left. Panic followed in waves that had nothing to do with the nearest battle command. Men stumbled blindly, hands clawing at the sky, seeking a logic that mathematics denied them. The physical aftermath was as brutal as the instantaneous moment had been precise. Within 24 hours, the maze of hedgerows and country lanes had become a necropolis of metal and flesh. Rivers took on the color of iron and sediment. Corpses lined embankments. The smell of rot and fuel blended into an odor that would haunt anyone who passed through. Vehicles, charred and spine-bent, sat like dead animals. Horses, once a common sight pulling field kitchens or ambulances, lay by the roadside where their labors had ended. Officers counted what they could salvage, fingers moving over lists that looked small and inadequate in the face of ruin. The human cost translated into numbers the way grief resists translating into language. Tens of thousands captured, thousands killed, hundreds of tanks and trucks destroyed. Men who had left their billets hoping to stretch the lines back a few days instead surrendered en masse. Peasants who had once watched columns pass now watched a flow of humanity disintegrate into single file, eyes hollow, hands raised in resignation. These tallies, grim, administrative, necessary, tell part of the story. The rest is in the weathered faces and in the silence of towns that went from the sound of transit to the stillness of abandonment. It is tempting to reduce the event to a moral, that the mechanized mind of the American war machine outmatched the courage of men on mud. There is truth in that, but incompleteness as well. Courage was not absent. In pockets, men charged through smoke to help the wounded. Officers scrambled to organize ad hoc defenses and evacuation. A tank commander who had his turret jammed did not simply resign himself. He ordered his crew to lever the hatch to help the wounded who were nowhere near a field hospital. The bravery of individuals did not change the arithmetic of synchronized fire. The point is harsher. Bravery and ingenuity could not, in that moment, override industrial logistics and mathematical precision. Logistics supplied the muscle for equations to have effect. The Red Ball Express and other lifelines ensured ammunition could keep flowing to the batteries that Parker and his team counted on. Factories in the United States kept filling crates with shells and VT fuses. Railheads moved equipment like arteries move blood. Major Williams's ledger did not salute, but it kept the guns supplied until their calculations translated into devastation. Where the German supply lines had been cut, where fuel ran low and spare parts were scarce, the American system could replace used barrels and feed batteries with rounds. Logistics turned arithmetic into sustained lethality. There is a particular cruelty in the way the fuses turned terrain into a uniform field of vulnerability. Hedge-lined roads, once effective for ambush and cover, became choke points funneled into death. Foxholes cut beside the road offered little solace when the air around you is filled with fragments tuned to wander above and then descend. The VT fuse, by detonating at a chosen altitude, bypassed the defenses that had been laboriously dug into the earth over years of trench warfare. It was not a single invention that won the day, but its introduction changed the cost-benefit calculus for any commander counting on cover and concealment. Between August 16 and August 21, the sequence of events that culminated in that crossroads moment illustrated a transition in war itself. It was not a single chronicle of decision and response, but a layering of choices and capacities. Hauser's decision to retreat came against a backdrop of attrition and the sense that keeping the corridor open might invite encirclement. Von Luck and other commanders tried to hold pockets together, but movement in any direction had been constrained by both the geography and the Allies' operational pressure. Parker and his FDC had time to refine their sequence because the American logistics network kept guns on position and ammunition flowing. Williams and his counterparts kept the pipeline clear. Barrels could be replaced, rounds allocated, batteries rotated. All of these elements conspired in technical harmony to produce a moment whose physical impact lasted a second and whose strategic consequence unfolded over days. It is crucial to be clear. The German Seventh Army did not literally vanish in 1 second. To say so would be to ignore weeks of maneuvering, days of attrition, and the systemic effects of supply shortages and strategic overreach. But in that single second, a vast amount of human and material potential was removed from the battlefield. Thousands were killed or wounded at once. Vehicles and vital equipment were rendered useless. Morale, already fragile, broke in 1,000 places. The 1 second is the instant where the industrial and mathematical work of weeks manifested as human erasure on a scale only possible when coordination, logistics, and a new kind of munition intersect. The moral geometry of that intersection is stark. On one axis lies courage and tactical skill, men who can read hedgerows, who can press armor through gaps, who can improvise repairs under fire. On the other axis lies mass, steel flowing from factories, railheads that never sleep, a supply chain that reduces war to numbers and timelines. The American advantage during this period was not solely superior courage or better doctrine. It was the ability to translate industrial output into precise, synchronized action at scale. 100 brave decisions at company level were still subject to the arithmetic that could blot them out. One could imagine alternative histories where the math failed, where synchronization drifted, where batteries misread a wind correction, where fuses malfunctioned. In those contingencies, columns might have staggered through with fewer losses, and the strategic map might have shifted slowly, but reality favors the path of capacity. The side that can sustain the tempo imposed by the machine will, more often than not, dictate the terms of engagement. In mid-August, the machine had reach and rhythm. Those qualities turned technical calculations into strategic victory. Reflection without pity is a hollow exercise, and pity without reflection achieves nothing. The soldiers in that crossroads were not abstractions. They were sons and brothers and husbands. The column's muddied boots belonged to men who had been drafted into a world that required them to carry other men by strength, and sometimes, tragically, to leave them. The engineers who designed VT fuses were not demons. They were technicians and scientists whose work was pressed into service by states and governments. If we wish to take a lesson from this, it is twofold. Recognize the human face of loss and understand how modern war transforms human endeavors into statistics. Strategically, the lesson is clear and uncomfortable. Military virtue at the tactical level, bravery, improvisation, decisive leadership is not enough when the opponent controls the industrial base and the tempo of warfare. Systems thinking becomes martial virtue. The commander with an eye for logistics and synchronization may lack the romance of frontline heroism, but holds the keys to survival in modern conflict. The collapse of an army's ability to resist can be incremental, bureaucratic, and then, at the moment of effect, instant and shattering. That paradox is the central shock we keep returning to. A long process of organization produces a second that changes everything. In the final accounting, the crossroads is both literal place and symbol. It was a place where roads converged and people queued. It was a point on a map where arithmetic met human bodies. It was a moment that felt instantaneous to those caught in it and was, in truth, the culmination of days of preparation, of factory floors running shifts, of supply officers making cold choices, of men like Hauser deciding between two bad options. The title that frames this story, "The Shocking Moment a German General Lost His Army in Just 1 Second," works as a provocation because it captures a truth about perception. The army was not erased by magic in a single heartbeat. It was mortally wounded by a process that expressed itself in one catastrophic instant. That instant is easier to point at than the weeks of logistics and attrition that led to it. Yet to understand what happened, one must hold both parts together: the long arithmetic of industrial war and the brief, brutal expression of that arithmetic as sound and metal and vanished lives. There is one more image worth leaving with: a folding watch taken from a dead officer, its hands stopped at a time that meant nothing without context, just as grief is often a stopped watch in a life otherwise full of motion. The watch recorded the second of impact, but the reason it mattered lay in the weeks of ammunition production, in the batteries set in fields based on maps and probability, and in the men who read those maps with quiet, precise cruelty. The mathematics did not prefer one side morally. It simply obeyed whoever had the capacity to feed it. If this account has stirred your curiosity about the technical side of World War II, about how mathematics and logistics shaped outcomes on the battlefield, please like and subscribe. There are more moments like this, where a single instant is the visible tip of a much larger process. War reduces the human to units that can be counted and systems that can be optimized. That reduction is useful for planning and horrendous in practice. The crossroads moment in mid-August was a high-precision confluence: synchronized gunnery, the VT fuse, and the sustained flow of ammunition meeting a congested corridor that could not disperse. The result was catastrophic and instructive. It taught a bitter lesson about the primacy of logistics and the deadly efficiency of synchronization. It taught that bravery is necessary but not sufficient in an age when industry can schedule death to the second. As the dust settled and the counting began, commanders catalogued losses and historians catalogued causes. For the men who survived, the memory was a film strip of sensory fragments: the sky that broke them, the sudden stillness, the river running dark, the way the air tasted afterward. For Hauser, and those who remained in the wake of retreat, the decision to pull back was both sensible and fated. Even the best judgment cannot always outrun an opponent whose tempo has been set by factories and watches. 1 second can be a poetic exaggeration or a precise observation depending on how you use it. In this case, it is both. It is a hook that draws you into the human story, and it is a literal description of how synchronized artillery expressed a larger campaign. The army was not annihilated by a moment alone. It was undone by a system whose apex was a single devastating second. Tell us in the comments which World War II moment you'd like analyzed next, and subscribe for more deep dives into the mechanics, mathematics, and human stories behind pivotal battlefield decisions.